The humid air around Point Cruz hung thick with tension as Second Lieutenant John George studied the shattered coconut groves ahead of him. It was January 22, 1943, and the 132nd Infantry Regiment had already lost more than a dozen men to Japanese snipers hidden among the trees. For 3 days, the same pattern had repeated: a single crack of rifle fire, a wounded or fallen American, and no visible trace of the shooter. Morale was slipping, and patrols moved with a cautious hesitation that slowed every operation west of Point Cruz. George rested his cheek against the worn stock of a Winchester Model 70, the same rifle many of his fellow officers had mocked since the day he brought it with him to Guadalcanal. He had purchased it long before deployment, paying for it with 2 years' worth of National Guard savings. It was a civilian sporting rifle, the sort hunters used for deer in the American Midwest, not a weapon expected on a Pacific battlefield. When he had first unpacked it, soldiers laughed and called it a mail-order souvenir. Captain Morris had been more direct, insisting that George leave it behind and carry the standard-issue M1 Garand like everyone else. But as the losses mounted, and the enemy marksmen kept their invisible grip on the battlefield, George believed the rifle's strengths mattered more than its reputation. The Winchester fired slower than the Garand, but its accuracy at long range far exceeded anything the Army supplied to ordinary infantry officers. Its Lyman Alaskan scope, rugged, reliable, and clear, gave George the chance to spot the slightest movement in the canopy where the enemy hid. Now crouched behind a collapsed hut, he scanned the grove with steady, deliberate patience. The Army taught that rate of fire and battlefield Volume 1 engagements. Yet here, against an enemy that rarely revealed more than a sliver of cloth or the reflection of a lens, precision mattered more than anything else. George steadied his breathing and waited. If the rifle could do what he believed it could, he might be able to break the lethal stalemate that had halted his regiment's advance for days. He had not come to prove his battalion wrong, but the moment demanded something the manuals had not prepared them for: a contest of patience and accuracy where a single well-placed shot meant more than a dozen bursts of semi-automatic fire. And in the stillness of the grove, George realized he was holding the only weapon among them truly suited to the fight ahead. The first shot George fired that morning slipped into the quiet like a needle through cloth. No dramatic recoil, no echoing blast, just a clean strike that snapped a palm frond high in the canopy. For several seconds nothing moved. Then a shape slumped forward, barely visible, and dropped through the branches. The nearby riflemen, who had been pinned down since dawn, lifted their heads in stunned silence. After 72 hours of casualties, someone had finally located one of the hidden shooters. George didn't celebrate. He kept still, adjusting the scope by a fraction, studying how the remaining snipers might react. Japanese sniper teams were disciplined, well-trained, and accustomed to waiting for hours before taking a single shot. They often worked in pairs, one firing, while the other watched for retaliation. George knew that killing one did not mean the others would abandon their positions. If anything, they would expect an American counter-sniper to reveal himself by standing or shifting too quickly. For the rest of the day, he moved no more than a few feet at a time, crawling to new bits of cover between the roots and fallen trunks. He used the Model 70 the way he had used it on long hunting treks back home, steadying the rifle, letting the landscape settle, and looking for the faintest irregularity: a leaf bent against the wind's direction, the flicker of a branch that didn't quite match the movement around it, even a glint that seemed too sharp to be a dewdrop. By sunset, he had identified and eliminated 3 more snipers. Each shot had required long minutes of observation, a timing that contrasted sharply with the rapid-fire doctrine the Army championed. The Garand excelled at delivering fast, reliable bursts of fire at medium range, but it lacked the precision George needed. At 300 yards, the Winchester's bolt-action stability and tight grouping made the difference between guessing at a target and striking it cleanly. As night settled over the grove, George and the small squad assigned to protect him dug into shallow positions. They spoke quietly, almost reverently, unsure how to reconcile the day's success with their earlier doubts about his rifle. The enemy would not stop. Japanese snipers were known to operate even after dark, taking advantage of moonlight to silhouette careless soldiers, but George had no plans to fire blindly into the trees. Accuracy required clarity, and clarity required patience. The second day was harder. The Japanese had learned from the previous losses and shifted their hiding places deeper into the grove. They dug firing pits at odd angles, weaving palm fronds around themselves so carefully that even the scope struggled to distinguish them from the landscape. The sound of their shots was muted, almost indistinguishable from the cracking bamboo. Twice, George saw nothing at all until a bullet snapped past a nearby tree. But the Winchester gave him confidence. Its smooth bolt cycle let him remain perfectly still after each shot, ready to re-aim without the jarring recoil of a semi-automatic mechanism. The light-gathering scope allowed him to pick out silhouettes even in shadowed undergrowth, and while others fired suppressive bursts hoping to flush the enemy out, George worked methodically, treating each shot as an individual decision. One sniper fell late that afternoon, another in the final hour before dusk. By the time the third day dawned, word had spread across the battalion. Officers who had dismissed the rifle as a toy now sent runners asking for George's assessment before moving their platoons. Patrols waited until he had scanned the groves. What had begun as a private, almost stubborn insistence on using a personal weapon had turned into a tactical advantage the regiment relied upon. Still, nothing about the work felt heroic to George. Each target represented a soldier as disciplined and determined as he was, a reminder that skill, not force, shaped these deadly exchanges. He stayed focused, aware that a single mistake could cost another American life. By the fourth day, the grove had grown eerily quiet. No more sudden shots, no more splintered tree trunks. The remaining snipers had either been eliminated or withdrawn. George rose from his position, dirt-streaked, exhausted, and surprised by how heavy the Model 70 felt in his hands after so many hours. 11 confirmed kills in 4 days. Not through faster fire, not through heavier rifles, but through precision, a kind of accuracy that challenged everything the Army believed about modern infantry combat. And though no formal order declared it, the officers now understood. The mail-order rifle was no toy at all. When the gunfire finally faded and the grove fell silent for good, the battalion staff gathered to assess what had happened. Reports listed the casualties, the captured ground, and the positions that had been cleared. Yet one detail appeared in every account: the unexpected effectiveness of a single lieutenant armed with a civilian rifle. Officers who had once laughed at George's mail-order sweetheart now approached him with measured curiosity, trying to understand how a hunting weapon had accomplished what dozens of standard-issue rifles could not. For decades, the U.S. Army had emphasized volume of fire as the hallmark of modern warfare. Ever since the introduction of semi-automatic rifles, training manuals praised rapid engagement, overwhelming bursts, and the ability to reload quickly during close-range battles. This doctrine had shaped not only equipment, but mindset. Soldiers were taught that speed and pressure won firefights. Accuracy was important, but not decisive. The Pacific Theater, however, was proving that carefully placed shots could matter far more than sustained firepower, especially when facing Japanese units trained in concealment and patience. George explained his method only when asked directly. He spoke plainly, noting that the Winchester's tight grouping at long distance allowed him to identify and engage targets that the Garand simply could not hit with certainty. He emphasized that the Lyman Alaskan scope was rugged enough to withstand the humidity and rough handling of jungle warfare, and he stressed that sniping in the Pacific was less about specialized equipment and more about mindset. The willingness to slow down, observe, and shoot only when absolutely sure. Yet George did not present himself as a revolutionary. If anything, he gave credit to years of hunting, to time spent tracking deer in tangled forests where staying still mattered more than moving fast. He had bought the Model 70 simply because he trusted it. The fact that it outperformed regulation weapons surprised even him, but the results were impossible to ignore. 11 snipers neutralized, an entire sector reopened for movement, and hundreds of soldiers able to operate without constant fear of an unseen enemy. Higher officers took note. Some quietly requested trials of scoped civilian rifles. Others consulted ordnance officers on whether similar modifications could be applied to existing military models. The Army had already fielded specialized sniper rifles, but they were few, often outdated, and not widely distributed. What George demonstrated, unintentionally, was that an accurate bolt-action rifle, even one bought from a civilian catalog, could be a decisive battlefield tool when handled by someone who understood its strengths. Still, skepticism lingered. Many believed George's success was an anomaly, the product of unusual conditions, rather than a sign that doctrine needed revision. Others doubted that ordinary infantrymen could be trained to replicate his patience and marksmanship. But the battalion could not dismiss the fact that Japanese sniper activity had dropped dramatically after George's 4-day engagement. Patrols advanced more confidently. Supply routes reopened. And for the first time in weeks, the regiment gained momentum. As reports traveled up the chain of command, they carried a subtle but unmistakable message. Precision marksmanship deserved more attention. The Pacific battlefields, with their dense foliage, hidden firing positions, and long intervals of silence, demanded a different skill set than the European theaters where rapid fire often dominated. George had not rewritten Army doctrine on his own, but he had revealed a gap large enough that commanders could no longer ignore it. And though no official commendation mentioned the Winchester Model 70 by name, officers throughout the division began discussing the rifle in hushed tones, treating it less as a curiosity and more as a potential asset. A weapon once dismissed as a novelty had forced the Army to reconsider its assumptions. In the weeks that followed the fighting west of Point Cruz, the events in the coconut groves took on a life of their own. George returned to regular duties, participating in patrols, scouting missions, and occasional engagements that demanded the same discipline he had shown during his 4-day duel with the Japanese snipers. Yet everywhere he went, someone mentioned the rifle. Soldiers asked to look through the scope. Platoon leaders asked how he steadied his breathing, or how he read the foliage when searching for concealed threats. Even officers from neighboring units made quiet inquiries, trying to understand whether his success could be replicated on other parts of the island. The Pacific Theater had no shortage of frontline improvisation. Soldiers modified equipment, reinforced uniforms with scavenged materials, and adjusted tactics to the dense vegetation and narrow trails. But George's example stood out because it provided something the Army had not expected: proof that individual marksmanship, when paired with suitable equipment, could counter one of the most feared threats of the campaign. Japanese snipers were not only accurate, they were also patient, often remaining hidden for days, supported by supply runners, and positioned strategically to cause the maximum disruption. When one of these marksmen chose a target, the result was often fatal. George's method spread informally at first. Squads began assigning a designated marksman, not a sniper in the formal sense, but someone known for careful shooting, to carry a scoped rifle whenever possible. Some borrowed commercial rifles from National Guardsmen or reservists who had brought personal weapons overseas. Others modified existing military rifles with civilian scopes, sometimes purchased privately, other times scavenged from damaged equipment. Ammunition handlers were instructed to set aside the most consistent batches of .20-06 cartridges for long-distance shooting. These ad hoc adjustments were not part of any official policy, but they reflected a growing recognition that accuracy mattered deeply in Pacific combat. The terrain itself reinforced the point. Dense undergrowth obscured movement, making it difficult for large units to maneuver or to provide covering fire. Enemy snipers could fire from elevated branches, mangrove roots, or cleverly concealed pits, often without revealing more than the faintest shadow. In such conditions, overwhelming firepower did little to resolve the threat. What the troops needed was someone who could find the source of a single shot and return fire with precision. George's battalion commanders took note of the change. They observed how patrols with a capable marksman advanced more confidently and incurred fewer casualties. They recorded improvements in communication and morale, and they began sending recommendations upward, asking for more specialized rifles, better optics, and instruction in counter-sniper tactics, something that had been an afterthought before Guadalcanal. Across the division, informal reports echoed the same theme. Soldiers needed tools suited to the environment, and a rifle capable of steady, accurate fire at long distances could tip the balance during defensive standoffs and patrol ambushes. The Winchester Model 70, though never adopted as standard issue, became a quiet point of comparison. Officers asked ordnance units whether similar bolt-action rifles could be issued to select marksmen. Some experimented with modified Springfield rifles, pairing them with stronger, clearer optics inspired by George's Lyman Alaskan scope. By the time the Guadalcanal campaign drew to a close, conversations about precision shooting had reached headquarters. What had begun as a single lieutenant refusing to part with a mail-order sporting rifle had sparked renewed interest in marksmanship standards that had been overshadowed by the push for rapid-fire infantry doctrine. The change did not happen overnight, nor was it formally credited to any single soldier, but those who served alongside George understood how the shift began. It started with a quiet hunter from the National Guard, crouched in a tangle of ruined palm trees, trusting a rifle no one else believed in, and it continued because the Pacific battlefield, unforgiving and unpredictable, proved that accuracy, not speed, often made the difference between survival and loss. When the campaigns pushed beyond Guadalcanal and into the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Philippines, the lessons learned from those early months traveled with the soldiers who had witnessed them. They carried stories of dense groves, hidden rifle pits, and the constant tension of fighting an enemy skilled in patient marksmanship, and woven into those stories was the memory of a lieutenant who had approached the battlefield with a perspective shaped less by military doctrine and more by years of careful observation in American forests far from any war. George himself did not seek recognition. He continued serving as an officer, applying the same steadiness he had demonstrated in the groves. His personal rifle remained by his side until supplies and logistics eventually improved enough for more standardized precision weapons to reach frontline units. But even as better equipment became available, soldiers still asked him about the method, the calm breathing, the careful scanning, the discipline to wait for the right moment. Many said that the rifle's origins mattered less than the mindset it represented. The Army, for its part, gradually formalized what field experience had already proven. Training manuals began to include sections on counter-sniper tactics in jungle terrain. Marksmanship programs expanded, emphasizing slow, deliberate shooting rather than only rapid fire. Improved scopes and rifles were issued in limited numbers, often to those already identified as reliable shots within their companies. None of these changes happened instantly, but they reflected a growing appreciation for precision as a battlefield necessity rather than a specialized curiosity. Historians later noted that these shifts fit a broader pattern throughout the war. Again and again, soldiers introduced small innovations that senior commanders adopted only after frontline experience made their value undeniable. In this case, the innovation had not been a new technology or a revolutionary tactic. It had been the simple decision of one officer to trust a rifle he knew well, even when regulations and expectations pointed another way. George's story is not one of mythic heroism or exaggerated accomplishment. It is a straightforward account of a soldier who recognized a gap in doctrine and filled it through his own skill and the tools he trusted. The 11 snipers he eliminated in those 4 days represented not only a tactical success, but also a demonstration of how individual initiative could influence broader military practices. The change his actions helped inspire, the renewed emphasis on accurate, deliberate shooting, would shape U.S. sniper doctrine for decades. Long after the war, when veterans recounted their experiences in the Pacific, some remembered seeing George crouch behind his Winchester, studying the tree line with the slow, patient confidence of someone who understood that survival often depended on quiet decisions rather than dramatic gestures. Others remembered how patrol routes reopened, how movement became safer, and how the fear of unseen rifle fire lessened after his 4 days of work in the Grove. These memories form the legacy of that mail-order rifle, not as a miracle weapon, but as an example of how precision, discipline, and adaptability can alter the course of a fight. The Model 70 never became standard issue, yet its impact lived on in the way the Army trained and equipped future marksmen, and the principles George demonstrated, patience, observation, and the belief that accuracy can outweigh speed, remain central to modern sniper doctrine. It began with a rifle no one wanted on the battlefield. It endured because the battlefield proved otherwise. The story of Lieutenant John George and his Winchester Model 70 did not dominate wartime newspapers, nor did it become the kind of legend that overshadows broader historical realities. Instead, it lived in a quieter space, in after-action reports, in the recollections of soldiers who served beside him, and in the gradual adjustments that reshaped American marksmanship doctrine during the later stages of the Pacific Campaign. Yet for all its understated nature, the episode symbolized something profoundly important about the way armies learn, adapt, and confront the unexpected conditions of war. World War II was shaped by vast strategies, in industrial production, and in global alliances, but it was also shaped by countless individual decisions made by ordinary soldiers in remote corners of the world. George's choice to bring a civilian rifle, purchased long before he ever imagined fighting in distant jungles, reflected a simple trust in a tool he understood deeply. His success in the coconut groves was not the result of extraordinary circumstance or technological advantage, but rather a union of skill, patience, and context. In a place where enemy snipers used concealment as effectively as any weapon, the Army's emphasis on speed and volume proved insufficient. Precision, often overlooked in modern doctrine, became essential. The outcome of his 4-day confrontation with Japanese marksmen did not alter the strategic direction of the Pacific War, yet it changed something subtler: the Army's appreciation for the role of disciplined, accurate shooting in difficult terrain. What began as a single lieutenant's insistence on carrying an unconventional rifle contributed to a shift in training and equipment that benefited thousands of soldiers who faced similar threats in later operations. The influence of these lessons continued long after the war, shaping sniper programs and reinforcing the principle that careful marksmanship remains relevant even in the age of rapid-fire weapons. It is important to remember that behind every tactical adaptation stands a human being confronting conditions no manual can fully anticipate. George's story illustrates how frontline realities often outpace official doctrine, and how innovation frequently emerges from necessity rather than planning. It also highlights the dynamic nature of historical truth, the recognition that even well-documented conflicts like World War II contain countless small episodes of adaptation, error, and insight that collectively influence the outcome of battles and the evolution of military practice. In the end, the legacy of the mail-order rifle is not one of romanticized heroism, but one of thoughtful observation. It reminds us that precision, patience, and a willingness to question assumptions can prove invaluable, not only on the battlefield, but in any context where the circumstances defy expectations. The quiet crack of George's Winchester Model 70 in the groves west of Point Cruz did not echo loudly across the war, but it echoed far enough to matter. And sometimes, in history, that is enough.